He was sent to bless the ruins. He came back without his voice. The altar had been sealed for over a century. The nails rusted, the wood warped, and behind it, something waited to be noticed. He couldn't write what he saw. He could only shake, and when he died facing the east wall. Understood here is the full horror script segment 4. It was winter when Father Albrecht arrived. A thin frost clung to the chapel windows like breath that had tried to escape. He stepped onto the gravel path alone. Boots cracking ice that had never fully melted. The trees were bare, but something still moved in them. The chapel, itself small, stone, half swallowed by the hillside, stood silent. No smoke, no bell, no sign of welcome. It had no name, only coordinates. Passed to him in a sealed envelope, and a letter with a wax seal, marked by a diocese that hadn't existed in 30 years. Father Albrecht had performed rites in war zones. He had blessed plague beds, stared into the eyes of men who wanted to confess with their last breath and could only gargle blood. But the moment he opened the chapel doors, he froze. The inside smelled wrong. Not rot, not mildew, but something held in the kind of air you only find in caves. In crypts or inside things that were never meant to be opened. There was no dust, no cobwebs. The pews were clean, the floor scrubbed, but no one had entered in decades. And at the far end of the nave, lit by nothing, touched by no shadow, stood the altar, a single block of dark marble, unpolished, unlabeled wrong. He walked toward it, carefully, step by step, as if expecting the floor to shift beneath him. It didn't, but the silence did. He later wrote that it was like stepping into a room full of people who were trying to breathe without being heard. There was no tabernacle, no crucifix, only a carved stone lamb, its eyes downcast, its mouth open like it was still trying to speak. Albrecht approached the altar, took the holy oil from his pocket. He intended to perform a standard consecration, the rite of re-blessing, a formality, but as he reached out to touch the surface, he stopped. His fingers hovered above the marble, then drew back, not in hesitation, in refusal. Later, he would say the altar was, his words, sealed from within, not locked, not closed. Sealed. The oil in his vial had turned thicker, darker, as if the very scent of sanctity had spoiled. He did not sleep that night. The guest cot in the caretaker's quarters remained untouched. Instead, he sat in the pews, hands folded, eyes fixed on the altar. He didn't blink often. Once, a rat scurried across the maze. Far wall. It stopped halfway. Its body froze, then turned around and fled without a sound. In the morning, Father Albrecht left. He did not close the chapel door behind him. He did not bless the ground. He did not kneel. He simply walked away down the hill, boots leaving no prints in the snow. He arrived at the train station before sunrise, sat alone on the wooden bench with his eyes wide open, mouth shut. He did not speak. The station master asked if he was ill. Albrecht shook his head, then nodded, then shook again. He took out his rosary, clutched it tight, pressed the crucifix into his own palm until the skin broke, but he never said a word. By midday, he boarded the train. Third class. Sat at the far window. He was seen muttering, but no words came out. The nun across from him offered water. He refused. He just kept staring at his hands. That night, in his quarters in Munich, he was found on the floor of his study. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of violence, only blood and silence. Had torn out his own tongue. No teeth marks, no hesitation wounds, as if it had been instructed. Tongue was never found, only the rosary, placed gently on the altar of his private chapel. The crucifix had been reversed. There was a note, one line scrawled in ink, so faint it looked like smoke. It never wanted mass. There was no explanation, no suicide note, no signs of insanity. The diocese archived the case under nervous collapse, but his journals told another story. Entries from the days leading up to the visit had been methodical, detailed, but after the day he stood before the altar, only blank pages, dozens except for one, written in a handwriting that did not match his own, scrawled at an angle across the very edges of the paper, like it had been written in a shaking room. It speaks in stillness, and it hears through stone. No ink blots, no corrections. The page had been folded in half, pressed between Psalm 22 and Psalm 23. That page is still stored in diocesan archives. They refuse to digitize it because the scan never completes every time someone tries. The machine stalls, then prints out a blank page. But in one instance, in 1996, a technician said he heard the scanner make a sound long, low tone, like the stretching of rope. He said it made his teeth ache. He left the room shaking. Never worked in archives again today. The chapel is considered unsanctioned ground. No bishop has been assigned to it in over a century. Name was removed from diocesan maps in 1922, but the building remains, and the altar has never been touched, not by hands, not by tools, not even by light. When sun hits the chapel's window, it dims, and when the door creaks open, rarely, accidentally, the air shifts not outward, but inward, like something is still holding its breath, waiting. And below the altar, just faint enough to be missed, there is a seam in the stone, a line too straight to be natural, too thin to be seen, unless you already know where to look, and once you do, you never quite stop looking. Understood? Here is the fully expanded cinematic horror script for Chapter 2, the prayer that refused to end. Word count 1,300 tone. Calm gives unease, gives suspicion, gives horror, gives collapsed structure. Liturgy of fear style, psychologically grounded, no fantasy. The chapel was never meant to echo. Its stone walls were thick carved, not built rounded, uneven, like something left behind rather than raised. But in the spring of 1876, for nearly 9 consecutive hours, one sound did echo, and it wasn't the sound of bells or of mass or of celebration. It was a single prayer repeated over and over, without change, not spoken. But soon the logs from that night still exist, bound in cracked leather, stored in a private archive beneath the seminary's west wing. 37 pages, and only one phrase repeated: Dona nobis pacem, grant us peace. But it wasn't a plea, not anymore. The choir director, Sister Aldara, had transcribed the timing of each phrase by hand. The spacing grows tighter with each page, at first 5 measures apart, then 4, then 3 by the 12th page. The spacing collapses. The prayer is written continuously, without breaks, as if rhythm had given way to urgency and then to compulsion. Rain began around 6:40 p.m. Thunder rolled in slow waves, but the choir did not stop. The door was bolted from the inside. No one came in, no one left. The witnesses were few, just 2 farmhands from the edge of the woods who'd brought fresh linen for the parish nurse. They knocked. No answer, but through the seams of the chapel's heavy door, they heard the singing, not loud, not joyous, just endless. A low, current male and female voices, unblinking. One of the farmhands, Caleb Rowe, reported something else, that the sound was wrong, not in tone, but in weight. He said it felt like the hymn was pushing against the door, like it didn't want them to open it, so they didn't. They turned back, returned home, told the nurse the chapel was busy. But by midnight, they changed their minds because the storm had passed. The wind had died, but the prayer was still going. Same words, same cadence, but now it sounded closer, too close. The next morning, when the door was finally opened, the inside of the chapel was empty. The choir was gone. The pews were undisturbed, no wax strips, no footprints, but the floor was warm, and not just warm, soft. The stones beneath the choir stalls had become sponge-like, almost pliable, like clay left too long in the sun. Sister Aldara was never seen again, but her final entry, penned in uneven ink, remained in the logbook. It was written vertically in the margin. In Latin, the words are no longer ours. They borrowed us. For years afterward, local workers refused to clean the choir alcove. They said the sound never fully left, that if you stood there for too long, you could feel the back of your teeth vibrate, not in pain, but in imitation, as if your jaw wanted to hum. The bishop at the time, Emil Dross, commissioned a new stone floor. The original tiles were removed, cracked in a perfect circle beneath where the choir once stood. Underneath, Not earth, not soil, but more stone, older, uncut, unfinished, and along the edges barely visible. Small fissures, not wide enough to see into, but long enough to make you feel like something was listening. The new floor was poured overnight. The bishop ordered the entire chapel sealed for 40 days. No mass, no confessions, no prayer. But it didn't help. On the 41st day, a new priest was assigned. Young, eager name was Father Trevin Cole. He began with a simple benediction. Alone, no congregation, no choir. He stood at the front, opened his hymnal and stopped, because when he opened his mouth, he didn't speak. He sang not just any phrase, not one he'd memorized, the same one Dona Nobis Pacem, but slower, as if the prayer was waiting in his throat. A sacristan, listening from the rear hallway, ran forward, grabbed the hymnal, shook him, tried to snap him out of it. But Father Cole wasn't entranced. He was confused, embarrassed. He said he didn't remember starting to sing, only that when he breathed in, the words were already there. It happened again 2 days later. This time in his quarters, he woke up humming 3 notes. Saint Key. He bit his tongue hard that night. He packed his things and left, took a train to Chicago, and never served again. The Vatican sent an inquiry. No reply was ever made public. The seminary archivist kept a letter, unofficial, unsigned, typed on a machine, missing its lowercase e. It said, "Some prayers are thresholds. When repeated too long, they become invitations." The note was found folded in the back of Sister Aldara's hymnal. No one knows how it got there or when, but for decades afterward, choirs who visited the chapel were told not to sing in Latin, especially not that phrase, and especially not in harmony. But in 1951, a group of university students ignored the warning. As a prank, they recorded themselves singing in the nave. Only one line, just once. They laughed. Left, went home. But when they played back the tape, it didn't stop. The tape repeated the phrase again and again, over and over, without gaps, without rewind. 37 minutes until the tape split. The cassette, still in university possession, was sent for analysis. They found no splicing, no loop, no edits, only one anomaly. Each repetition was slightly different, not enough for the human ear, but enough for the waveform. Each one bent, just slightly, like it had been sung from a different throat. 53 voices. One line, same tone, but the final voice was deeper and not human. The university destroyed the tape, but not before it was copied. One copy still circulates in closed forums. It's called The Last Choir. It ends with silence, but not digital silence. Not the quiet of nothing. It's the sound of something holding its breath. And underneath, if you raise the volume high enough, some say you can hear stone cracking. Not all at once, just slow and deep, like something inside the wall has finally learned the words and is trying to sing them back. Got it. I'll now begin writing Chapter 3. Letter from the East Wing, as a full horror script segment in the exact tone and structure you specified. Please hold a moment while I generate the complete 1,300-word script. Here is the full cinematic script for Chapter 3, A Letter from the East Wing. 1,300 words. In the Liturgy of Fear style, dust didn't settle in the East Wing. It hovered not like it was stirred, but like it was waiting a low corridor, lined with iron sconces that hadn't held fire in over a century. Peeling paint, curled like dead parchment, and a silence that didn't feel passive. It pressed. The chapel's East Wing hadn't always been sealed. In fact, it was once living quarters, 4 narrow cells for caretakers. One bell pull at the end of the hall. But in 1914, after the last caretaker was removed, the hallway was shuttered, plaster nailed over stone, a thin cross carved into the mortar, and silence for nearly 60 years. No one touched it until 1971. A fire, confined to the archive room directly above the East Wing, firefighters said it was an electrical fault, but there was no wiring in that part of the building, and what survived was a trunk, blackened, warped, left just beneath the pulpit stairs, as if someone had tried to drag it away before the flames reached inside. No relics, no cloth, only one thing, a journal, cloth bound, stamped only with initials, Art and A year 1923. Its pages faded, water damaged, or not dated consistently. Some were backdated, others overwritten, but the entries shared one location, a single-room east wing. Cell 3. The writer identified himself only once. Brother Remiel, and his job was cleaning. He was not clergy, not ordained, not trained, just assigned. Alone his first entry. Unremarkable. Cleaned baseboards, tile chipped under window smell. Stronger today incense helps, but by the third entry, the tone fractures. Heard movement in the wall, not rodent, larger sound repeated hollow behind stone. He drew a diagram, crude, uncertain, but one detail stood out. He marked the chapel, wall behind the altar with an X, and wrote underneath, behind the lamb. The lamb refers to the carved relief behind the altar, an ornamental stone motif, shaped like the Lamb of God, meant to symbolize purity, sacrifice. But the journal describes it differently, not as a carving, but as a covering. Entry 6. Sound returns each night, rhythmic like breath. Lamb's eyes don't match, one is deeper. He tried tapping the stone, it echoed only once, on the left eye, and then according to entry 8, he began hearing whispers. Did not recognize the language. It came only when the candles were lit, and only when he stood alone. He tested it for weeks, brought other caretakers into the chapel. No sound, no voice, but the moment he stood alone, it resumed. Entry 12 reads, voice said, he watches through what was bled for. Did not recognize tone male, but dry like it had never used lungs. Brother Remiel's health declined. He noted blurred vision, loss of appetite, cold fingertips, but he refused to leave. He believed he had been assigned to listen. Entry 16. It is not cruel. It is not angry. It is waiting. I believe it hears our prayers, but not from this side. No one noticed his condition. Caretakers rotated monthly. His name appeared on no official record by the 20th entry. His writing changed, words crowded the page, margins disappeared, ink bled into the fiber, but one sentence, scrawled in capital letters, was repeated 3 times. It is behind the LAMB. Investigators reviewing the journal in 1972 noticed the spine had warped. It wasn't burnt. It had been twisted as if something inside it had tried to curl. But it's the final entry that the archivist refused to read aloud, found on the inside back cover, scratched into the paper with what appears to be a nail. No ink, no signature, just one sentence. It watches from behind the carved lamb, and below it, a single indentation in the paper, not writing, not drawing a fingerprint, pressed so deep, it tore through. Remiel was never found. No body, no exit record, but his cell east wing. 3 was sealed when archivists attempted to open it. They found the hinges fused. No fire had reached that hallway, but the metal had melted, and the doorframe, once oak, was cracked vertically from top to base, not from force, but from pressure, as if something inside had pushed an anonymous letter, postmarked from Quebec in 1983. Arrived at the local diocese, typed no return address. It read, you built the chapel over something meant to stay buried. The altar isn't facing God, it's facing the door. Bishop Harrow, who oversaw the grounds, at the time ordered a full inspection. No structural weaknesses were found, but when they removed the lamb carving for restoration, they discovered something unusual. Behind it, embedded in the wall, was glassa, narrow pane, circular, no known purpose, not a window, not a frame, just glass set into the stone, and covered. A thin layer of soot had built on its surface. Despite the wall being sealed, when wiped clean, the glass revealed nothing, just stone on the other side until the second wipe. Then a shimmer-like movement, as if something shifted behind the wall. Technician who wiped it, name redacted from all subsequent documents, refused to return. Would only say one thing before resigning. There was no reflection. Since then, the lamb relief has not been removed, but under certain lights, the outline of the glass can still be seen faint, just at the edge, like an eye turned sideways, watching, waiting, and inside the lamb's left eye, barely visible to the naked eye, a new fissure has appeared. It's not wide, it's not deep, but it's growing. and it hums certainly. Here is the complete cinematic horror script for Chapter 4, The Midnight Mass That Wasn't Scheduled, approximately 300 words, written in the style and tone of Liturgy of Fear. There are no animals in the valley after dark. Locals say the birds stop singing just after dusk, that the crickets fall silent before midnight, that even the wind won't pass near the chapel once the last light dies. And on the night of June 3rd, 1931, the bells rang not once, not twice, but 12 times, each toll measured even and perfectly clear. But no mass had been scheduled. The records from that week were routine. No feast days, no burials, no weddings. The priest, Father Ellison, had not been seen in 3 days. His home still locked from the inside, his bed undisturbed. And yet, at midnight, the bells rang. A small group gathered, mostly farmers, the older widow from the South Hill, a teacher, one of the children she had brought for night lessons. None of them expected the doors to be open. They were never left open, but there they stood, unlatched, swung wide, and inside. The candles were lit, not just the altar's ring, but every side aisle, every pew, even the votives near the vestry. Each wick stood perfectly still, flame held as if by breathless lungs, and no one was there. Chapel had always held a particular kind of silence, not peace, stillness, a silence that felt aware that night. It felt heavier. No wind entered through the open doors. No dust stirred, only heat, the kind of heat that rises from closed tombs. It wasn't visible, but it pressed into the sinuses, into the eyes, like breath exhaled across stone. The teacher, Miss Norrell, stepped inside first. She would later say she felt watched, not from above, but from below. The boy clung to her hand. He did not speak, would not speak again for 2 days. She said he squeezed once hard when they passed the pulpit, and that's when she saw the footprints, not from the front, from the side, near the apse, one set bare, each print slightly darker than the last, as if drawn from something below the floor. They trailed forward to the altar, not away from it. There were no returning prints. Group formed a loose semicircle behind the first row of pews. No one spoke. They didn't have to. Something in the room made speech feel wrong, offensive, dangerous. Miss Norrell described the sound as a pressure in the eardrums, not a tone, not even a hum, but the feeling of standing too close to a running organ pipe. And then, from nowhere, the incense swung. No chain, no acolyte, just the thinnest bell chime. And the censer moved it past once, left to right, then back again. The scent wasn't the usual frankincense. It was acrid, like old vinegar, and sweet rot. The boy vomited, but it made no sound when it hit the stone, just a dull splash. And the ringing stopped. No one could say how long. They stood there. The candles did not burn down. No wax spilled. No time passed visibly, but the prints were gone. Just gone. One moment. Their next moment, stone smooth, no residue, no moisture, just bare, dry floor. And behind the altar, a shape, something, stood briefly in the candlelight, not casting shadow, but bending it. It was not tall, not hunched, but narrow, like a body wrapped too tightly, head bowed, hands at its side. No one remembered seeing it move, but when the teacher blinked, it had turned to face the pulpit, and the altar cloth, once pressed flat, now draped downward, as if something beneath had shifted. One of the men, Samuel Riggs, finally broke, shouted for the group to leave, claimed the bishop had told him to watch for signs. The moment his voice rose, the candles flared, not one, all of them. Every wick burst 6 inches high, and the bells rang again, but not 12, just one, a single low toll, slower than before, as if pulled by something heavier than rope. That's when the boy screamed, but no sound came out. His mouth opened, his neck strained, but the chapel swallowed Ithe, clawed at his ears. Miss Norrell dragged him from the pew. She swore her feet didn't touch the ground until they were outside. Everyone else followed. No one ran, no one screamed. They just left as if led. When the bishop arrived 2 days later, the doors were closed, locked, candles gone, altar cloth replaced, stone unmarked, ordered the chapel sealed for a week, and the bell tower inspected. There were no ropes, no gears. No visible mechanism, just the bell and dust thick untouched except for one place. The railing near the tower window had been gripped clearly, tightly, 5 fingers, set deeper than skin alone could press, and below the prints, a single drop of dried wax black, not burnt, not colored, just black. He ordered it buried, had the railing removed, but the candles relit themselves. That Friday 3 parishioners confirmed it, and that Sunday the footprints returned. Only this time there were 2 sets, and still no one returning. Thanks. Target locked. Approximately 260 words now, beginning the full cinematic narration for Chapter 5. When the bishop was sent, please hold. The clouds moved strangely that morning, low, unbroken, gray, like a lid being fastened over the hills. Bishop Marion had not been meant to come. 3 others had declined before him. One cited illness. Another simply said, "I won't enter that place again." But Marion accepted quietly, without hesitation. He arrived on the 14th of March, 1958. Just after sunrise, the chapel stood as it always had, no more decayed than the photographs from decades prior. The stone hadn't weathered the roof, though bowed, had not collapsed. The bell tower still held its shape, but it hadn't rung in years, or so they claimed. Marion's assistant, Father Harlan Witt, was 29, newly ordained, and eager. He drove the bishop in from Nashville. The path to the chapel had narrowed since the maps were drawn. The trees bent toward the road, unnaturally closer, near the stone building, as if the forest was folding in around it. They parked beside the chapel just before 9 o'clock. Marion said nothing, just stared up at the arched windows. The glass had long since gone cloudy, but the shape of the crucifix still cast its shadow on the inside. Witt asked if he should unlock the doors. Marion didn't answer. He walked forward, slowly, deliberately, but the doors were already open inside. The air smelled of old cedar and burnt. Wax dust floated visibly in the beam of light from the eastern window. Dozens of wooden pews stood unoccupied, unbothered. Not a single one had been shifted. At the far end, behind the altar rail, stood the stone slab, the altar unmoved since 1841. Witt stepped in second, murmuring something under his breath. A prayer, maybe a ward, but his voice trailed off when he saw the altar cloth, white and unadorned, was folded differently than before, not draped, pulled back as if someone had been reaching underneath it and then left it. Bishop Marion did not pause. He walked directly to it. Then he kneeled. There were no words spoken, no rite begun, no holy oil drawn. He simply placed both hands on the floor before the altar, bowed his head, and stayed there. Witt waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The stillness began to ache, and that's when he heard Ida whisper, not inside the chapel, behind the altar, shuffling sound, slow, measured like cloth over stone. Witt took one step closer and stopped because he saw the bishop's hands were trembling, not violently, but rhythmically, like they were following something. He called to him quietly, then louder, but Marion didn't move, didn't speak, didn't blink. It was then that Witt circled behind the altar to reach him, and what he saw made him stop breathing. Marion's eyes were wide open, glassy, unmoving, fixed not at the crucifix above, at the carved base of the altar. Shape had been revealed beneath the cloth, a deep engraving. It hadn't been there before. It was a lamb, but its eyes were open too wide, and its mouth had too many teeth. The stone around it was moist, wet to the touch. Witt recoiled. He grabbed the bishop's arm and shook it. No response, just breath, slow, calm, and silent. He ran, left the chapel in silence, got in the car, and drove to the nearest town. He sent word to the diocese, told them the bishop had taken ill, urged them to send help quickly. But when others returned with him 2 days later, the chapel was empty. No sign of the bishop, no footprints, no robes, no breath on the air. Only one thing remained behind the altar. On the floor where he had knelt, someone had carved a line into the stone with their fingernail. Not dead, not speaking, just waiting. And the lamb was gone. The carving had vanished, but the stone was darker, now as if it had drunk something. Witt never returned to priesthood. He refused to speak of what happened inside the chapel, only once years later. In hospice, he told a nurse, "It doesn't want prayers anymore. It wants presence." And then he died, no last rites, no confession. His tongue had scarred itself from constant biting, like something had been trying to get out. And that's when the bells started again, just once midnight, and only once for now. The scaffolding had been up for weeks. Now dust settled in thick layers on every surface, caught in golden shafts of late morning light that filtered through the stained glass windows. Beneath the muted colors of saints and sinners, work crews moved carefully, never speaking above a murmur. As if something in the air demanded reverence, the chapel was silent, even with the hammering, the drilling, the dragging of heavy tools. It all felt muted, swallowed somehow. They were restoring the altar when the first photo was taken. Not by a professional, not by an inspector, just a worker Daniel, a man in his 30s. The kind who didn't believe in much, but liked to document his jobs for his portfolio. He snapped a picture, checking the symmetry of the newly exposed brick. Behind the altar, he didn't notice anything odd. Not then, but when he got home and looked closer, something was there. A pattern carved deep behind the altar. It was subtle like calligraphy, half sunk into damp paper, soft and pale like skin under thin gauze. A series of symbols running in a crescent shape across the top of the stone. They bent backward, like they'd been carved in reverse, as if written not for eyes on this side of the wall. He showed his supervisor the next morning. They returned to the chapel. Same wall, same spot, clean, smooth stone, no markings, not even a scratch. They tried again, took more pictures, waited until the light shifted. Nothing appeared in person, but the photos told another story. Each one showed more than the last. First, it was just the crescent curve, then something almost like script, not letters, not words, but close. A consultant was brought in, a man named Ainsley, who'd done work with medieval restoration projects across Europe. He studied the images in silence for a long time. Then he asked to be alone in the chapel for nearly 4 hours. He didn't come out when he finally did. He wouldn't meet anyone's eyes. He only said one thing before he left. It's a prayer only the building could understand, and he never returned later. They discovered that Ainsley had left a voicemail for a colleague in Rome, someone affiliated with the Vatican's archival division. The message was short, breathless. It's not a language, it's a rhythm, a reversal, like listening to a hymn played backward through water. Nobody could quite make sense of what he meant. Meanwhile, Daniel, who'd taken the first photo, began experiencing something he described as auditory memory. He told his girlfriend he could hear the photos, not literally, but whenever he looked at them, there was a sensation like the hum of a distant choir, a pressure at the back of the head, and something else. He said it felt like a hand slowly turning his spine, one vertebra at a time. 2 weeks later, he quit the job, deleted every file, refused to speak to any of the crew, but others were curious. Now one technician, Joel, decided to photograph the wall using thermal imaging just to see. The resulting image showed colder regions across the stone, perfectly aligned with the carvings. Not just surface cold, subterranean. The wall was reading as several degrees colder than the rest of the building. But the next day, it wasn't cold. It was wet, not moist. Not damp, wet. The stone behind the altar glistened like it had been pulled from a river. Beads of water pooled along the base and seeped into the floorboards. A single trail of it ran down the side like sweat. No pipe burst, no condensation, and the weather had been dry for weeks. A crew member touched it, said it felt warm. They tested the moisture lab results, came back inconclusive. It wasn't groundwater, no known mineral content, nothing that made sense. The decision was made to halt renovations indefinitely. Site was cordoned off, photos were logged and sent to a local university for analysis. But nothing useful came back except one comment buried in an email thread by a doctoral student in liturgical anthropology. It's not the carvings you should be worried about. It's why they had to be hidden behind the altar. Who were they praying to? No one replied in the months that followed. Rumors began circulating among those who'd worked the site. Joel claimed he had dreams of a chapel with no roof, where the sky bled in reverse, where time seemed to pour upward, another worker described, hearing a voice behind him every time he turned on a camera, not whispering, breathing, and yet no one outside the project seemed to care. No official investigation was launched. The diocese declined to comment. Insurance was quietly settled. The entire renovation was labeled structurally unstable. And that was it, but one photo they never submitted. Never archived still circulates in private groups. A high-resolution shot, taken just before they shut everything down. It shows the wall behind the altar, the crescent shape, the reversed carving, the wet stone. But if you zoom in, right at the center, beneath the curve, at a point where the markings converge, like a hidden fulcrum, there's an impression, a small shape, like the edge of a mouth open waiting. And if you flip the photo horizontally, if you mirror the entire image, the markings make more sense. They don't form a word, but they form something that stares back, and it hasn't blinked. The chapel always felt colder at night, even in the summer of 1984, when the rest of the seminary grounds seemed to sweat beneath the weight of July. The interior of St. Lintus remained still breathless, as if the air inside had never learned to move freely. 3 theology students had been living just down the hall. Michael Kress, Jonas Bell, and Thomas Arnett. They were in their 3rd year. Quiet, disciplined, but curious. Too curious. All 3 had access to the chapel, trusted by the faculty, trusted enough to know about the wall behind the altar. It had been sealed long before they arrived, years, perhaps decades prior, cemented shut and boarded over during a series of undocumented repairs. No priest mentioned it, no blueprints acknowledged it, but every student who passed through those pews had seen it. The seam, the hairline cracked behind, the altar rail like the outline of a door. No one wanted to open. Michael said he'd overheard something, a conversation between 2 of the elder priests, words like containment, not meant for eyes, and removal never completed. He told Jonas and Thomas the next day. They waited a week. They planned at night. In hushed tones, drew sketches, located the maintenance keys, timed the footfalls of the night porter, watched how long the outer hall lights stayed on once triggered, and on the evening of July 18th, they entered the chapel at 1:43 a.m. The wooden doors opened soundlessly. The air inside had that same smell. It always had: damp fabric, wax, and something older, something like dust scraped from the inside of a book that should have never been opened. They moved quickly, with flashlights, not speaking, only nodding. Jonas held the crowbar. Thomas had the gloves. Michael carried the camera. It wasn't recorded on video, only photos, blurry, uncentered, nervous hands. The first few show them standing before the altar, their shadows huge on the stone wall behind. Then, the panels being pried away, chunks of brittle wood breaking off in their hands. Then, the stone surface beneath, not flat, not carved, indented, a shallow groove, waist height, forming a circle around what looked like a recessed panel. Metal bolts at 4 corners, and at the center, something they hadn't seen before, a mark, shaped like a mouth, but vertical, split down the middle, seamless. They tried the bolts, rusted, but movable. One by one, they twisted free, and then the photographs stopped. The chapel remained silent for the next 2 days. No one noticed their absence at first. It was summer term, fewer students, fewer eyes. The dorms quiet, their beds looked slept in. But by the 3rd day, a groundskeeper noticed something strange. The chapel door was ajar just a few inches, enough to see that the lights were still on when security entered. They found the 3 students kneeling in front of the altar, facing away from it, all 3 still unmoving, their heads bowed low, hands resting on their thighs. Their eyes were covered, each one blindfolded, with strips of white linen, perfectly, even tight, but not bruising. Their mouths were sealed shut, not with tape, not with wire stitched, each one closed cleanly. No blood, no puncture marks, just the lips drawn together in 3 parallel lines. But there was no thread, no string, no fiber, nothing binding the skin, just the appearance of having been stitched, like the body had agreed to close itself when they were touched. They trembled. All three were alive, but unresponsive. No trauma to the skull, no signs of physical restraint, and no damage to the fingers or hands that might indicate self-inflicted harm. Medical personnel arrived within the hour. They were transferred to St. Catherine's Psychiatric Hospital in Dover. Each one was placed under observation, and each one remained silent. Their eyes remained blindfolded, not by staff, but by request. Once the cloth was removed from Michael's face, his pulse skyrocketed. He screamed until his throat tore. The bandage was reapplied immediately. It took weeks before. One of them broke the silence. It was Jonas. In a moment of lucidity, he spoke one sentence. It asked us not to look. He died 2 days later. Cardiac arrest. No history of heart problems. Thomas Arnett followed 2 months later. He'd begun compulsively writing in his cell, tiny, indecipherable script, always in the same spiral pattern, always beginning at the edges and working inward. Found him curled in the corner one morning, fingernails torn from scratching something into the tile. A single word over and over: stay. Michael Kress remained institutionalized for 12 more years. He spoke rarely, but during one interview in 1995, he was asked why they opened the altar. He said nothing at first, then, quietly, "We didn't open it. We tried, but it had already been opened." When asked who opened it, who had come before them, he shook his head. Then he added, almost inaudibly, "You don't open it from this side," and he never spoke again. The room behind the altar was resealed, this time with reinforced concrete. No records were kept, no incident filed publicly, but a custodian who was present that night claimed to have seen something beneath the recess, something they were told not to mention. Second groove, circular, but smaller, and in the center of it, something that looked like a tooth. When asked to describe it years later, he said he couldn't, not because he didn't remember, but because he still dreamt of chewing things that weren't food. And when he woke up, there was always something stuck in his teeth, something soft and wet. The windows in his room had been sealed shut since Marche. Faint light filtered through the gauze curtains, thick with dust, heavy from time and disuse outside. The wind scraped against the stone walls of the rectory inside. Everything was still stagnant. It had been nearly a year since Bishop Marion last spoke. Not a word since the morning after the 3 students were found kneeling in front of the altar. Not to his secretary, not to the doctors, not even to God. He still rose early, dressed himself in the same clothes, moved slowly, always the same routine: breakfast, untouched, prayer. At a desk he no longer seemed to recognize, but no sound, no blessing, no voice, only the scratching. It began in June at first. The nurses thought it was just a nervous habit, something mild maybe, the way older hands fidget when the world begins to drift away. He would trace shapes in the dust, always the same motion, circular, then diagonal, then a kind of loop. It wasn't recognizable at first, just lines, but after a week, patterns began to form. The same figure over and over, on the desk, on the window pane, on the wooden floor beneath his chair, even on the rim of his dinner plate, drawn into the thin film of condensation with the edge of his thumb, a kind of sigil. It didn't match any known religious iconography, not from Catholic rites, not from ancient texts, but it had rhythm and tension, like someone writing in a language they never learned, but somehow still remembered. A visiting psychologist, Dr. Eileen Maris, began documenting the shapes. She compiled over 80 examples, each one unique in its minor imperfections, but unmistakably the same symbol. She asked him what it meant. He didn't respond, didn't blink, just raised his finger to the tabletop and drew it again. That was the last time he made eye contact. Over the following weeks, the drawings increased. By late July, he was tracing the sigil in his sleep. His hands would rise from beneath the blankets, slow, trembling, and sketch the motion against the sheets again and again, until morning. Staff tried limiting his access to surfaces. They gave him gloves, changed his room, removed anything with dust or condensation, but he adapted. They found the symbol etched into soap, pressed into the butter of his toast. scraped lightly into the leather binding of his Bible. No tools were ever found, just the ridges of his fingernail, and the quiet drag of skin over skin thin. One morning in September, he stopped drawing it. Lasted 2 days, and then the tremors began at first. It was barely visible, just a slight twitch in his right index finger, but by evening, both hands were affected constant motion, as if he were still trying to draw. But the air had turned against him. They ran tests, ruled out Parkinson's, ruled out stroke. No neurological explanation, but he couldn't hold a spoon, couldn't press a button, couldn't steady a page long enough to read his hands, moved as if something inside them had decided not to stop at night. The staff heard him breathing differently, not louder, not faster, just wrong, like he was counting something without numbers. On October 2nd, his secretary, Father Glenn, reported finding a final drawing, not in the usual places, not in dust or on glass, but in blood-thin streaks traced across the inside of his pillowcase. Still the same shape, still the same lines drawn with the side of his hand where the skin had cracked open from overuse. Blood sample was taken, no infections, but elevated. Cortisol signs of extreme, prolonged stress. His body was responding as if it had been running from something for months. Even though he had not left the room, a visiting priest, Father August Van Eck, was permitted to visit. He had known Marion since seminary. He later told an interviewer that what disturbed him most wasn't the silence, it was the smell, like a cellar that had been locked too long, he said, but with something living still inside it. Van Eck tried to bless the room, spoke softly, quoted scripture. Marion didn't look up, but just before Van Eck stood to leave, Marion's hands began to twitch more. Violently, he held them out, palms up, as if asking for something to be taken away, and with his trembling finger, he traced the sigil one last time on the back of Van Eck's hand. Van Eck washed it off within the hour, but days later, he was hospitalized, not for illness, not for injury. He had gone mute, refused food, refused eye contact, refused to speak of anything, except the exact temperature of the room he was in. He kept whispering the same number, 12.7. No one knew what it meant. Bishop Marion passed away the following winter. Autopsy was inconclusive. No signs of trauma, no signs of illness. Only one strange finding. His right index finger, the one he always used to draw, showed unusual wear on the bone, microscopic grooves, repetitive motion over a prolonged period, as if the joint had been grinding itself down from the inside. His room was emptied, sanitized furniture, replaced, all items discarded, but the wall beside the bed refused to clean. They tried 4 kinds of solvent still, beneath every fresh coat of paint. When the light caught it just right, the sigil was still there, and it hadn't faded. It was darker. The chapel had been empty for days. Sunlight came in at an angle, now thinner, sharper, as if it no longer belonged inside. Dust floated in slow spirals beneath the rafters. The scent of oil and stone lingered in the pews. Nothing moved, but something had changed in the final days before renovations were suspended. Father Lennox requested a sound test. The plan was simple: determine how well the space carried voices. He wanted to understand the acoustics, how sermons echoed, how breath carried across marble and wood. He used a standard cassette recorder. Nothing advanced, just an old black unit with silver knobs and a tape that had already been used before once, maybe twice for choir rehearsals. He placed it on the altar, pressed record, and walked away. The chapel remained closed for the next 5 hours. No services, no maintenance, no staff, no one entered. When Lennox returned, the recorder was still running. The tape nearly full. He stopped it, rewound, played the first few seconds silence, which made sense. The chapel was supposed to be empty. But later, when he transferred the audio to his office system, hoping to measure the baseline hiss of the room, he heard something else, something beneath the silence. It was subtle at first, almost masked by the hiss of the tape, but not quite breath, slow, measured, deliberate inhale. A pause, exhale, then. Again, it was not Lennox. The pattern was too consistent, too slow, like someone who wasn't nervous, wasn't waiting. Just there, he checked the logs, reviewed. Camera footage from the outer hallway no one entered, but the sound continued at the 2-minute mark. Another sound appeared, a low creakwood heavy dry, and silence again. 10 seconds later, another creak, slightly sharper this time, then again, and again like the sound of a pew being lowered under weight, then released, sitting, rising, sitting again, always the same rhythm. 3 seconds between creaks, no variation, no footsteps, just the motion of weight, down and down. Again, Lennox called an audio technician, Henry Stokes, from the Archdiocese office, a quiet man, very logical. He spent 2 days studying the tape. He confirmed it wasn't corrupted. No signal interference, no secondary feed. He even ran the tape through magnetic imaging. The recorder had only picked up what was physically present, which made the result harder to explain, because by minute 11, the breath changed. It became shallower, still slow, but less structured, less human. Henry described it as a kind of inward exhale, as if the lungs weren't filling from air, but emptying into themselves. Then came the pressure, not on the tape, but in the room where it played. Lennox and Henry both reported the same sensation, a weight at the base of the neck, like hands resting there, not hard, just there. They played the tape twice, same result on the third playback. The creaking returned, louder this time, less spaced, like the rhythm had quickened, more frantic. The breath shortened, thin click, sound of the recorder's stop button, except no one had pressed it. The original tape had captured its own end asterisk. The motion, the tension, the mechanical thump of a button being pushed. From nowhere, when they examined the device again, the button was partially depressed, jammed, as if it had been stopped mid-motion, frozen just before fully locking into place. Henry returned home that evening. He called in sick the next day, never picked up another tape again. Lennox, meanwhile, placed the cassette in a secure drawer, logged it as anomalous, and made one copy for diocesan records. That copy was later lost, but not before one last analysis. Dr. Lee Morgan, a researcher in sonic anthropology, was asked to examine the frequencies, looking for ambient clues, environmental signatures. She found one in the background of the breathing. Below the pitch of the human voice was a low, sustained note, almost sub-audible. She described it as not a hum, but a presence, a frequency that didn't waver. It wasn't tied to the breath or the creaks. It was just there, flat, solid. Underneath everything. She compared it to standing inside an engine that wasn't running, but was still warm. She isolated the tone, amplified it when played alone. It triggered physical discomfort in most listeners. Not fear, not pain, but something worse. Disbelief. One technician stopped the playback halfway through, said it made him feel like he had forgotten something important, but couldn't remember what it was, and that when he looked at the door afterward, he wasn't sure if it had always been closed. No one can say what the recording captured. There were no voices, no names, no footsteps, only the slow act of sitting and standing and sitting again, and always. The breath. Lennox sealed the original cassette in an envelope, stored it inside the chapel's old tabernacle, no longer in use. When asked why, he said, if someone wants to hear it again, they'll have to come stand where it was recorded. That tabernacle has since been removed. The entire altar was dismantled during final demolition, but the tape, wherever it is now, has never officially resurfaced. Only a digital file remains. Half a transfer, missing the last 30 seconds cut off. Mid-creak. Some say, if you loop that last sound long enough, you start to hear something in the silence that follows. Not a word, not a cry, just the sound of something getting closer each time. The chapel hasn't been touched in years. Its stone exterior is cracked at the corners, worn soft from decades of weather, but somehow still standing. Ivy has claimed one side entirely. Shutters hang loose over hollow window frames. The wood beneath the eaves groans when the temperature drops. The structure holds, and the door, though warped and blistered, remains shut. No one is assigned to it anymore. No congregation, no services. The registry was formally dissolved by the diocese in 1997, but even before that, the pews had long since emptied. There was no final sermon, no announcement, no closure. People simply stopped going one by one. Altar was stripped of its cloth, the sacraments removed, candles left to burn down to stubs, Bibles taken home and never returned. But the bell still rings, not every night, not predictably, only on the quiet ones, nights when the sky is clear and low, when even the trees forget to rustle, when the fields don't move, when the whole landscape seems to pause like it's listening. That when the sound comes one toll, then another, wide gaps between them, and then more, not in a sequence, not in time, but counted. Locals have kept record. In 2003, the bell rang 16 times on a windless August night. The next morning, a former sacristan died in his sleep. That same year, it rang 12 times following the death of a visiting priest who had once tried to photograph the hidden wall. The numbers don't follow any known liturgical calendar, but those who've lived near the grounds say there's a pattern, that it rings once for every prayer left unanswered inside the chapel, and once more for the one still waiting behind the altar. The sound doesn't travel far, a few hundred feet at most. The recordings, when attempted, always come back blank, but to those who hear it in person, it's unmistakable. Not a sharp toll, not a clear note. It's damp heavy, like a bell rung not from the rope, but from inside the metal itself, as if the weight had dropped inward. They say the first toll always feels like a cough behind your ear, that you don't hear it until it's already passed. In 2011, a group of theology students from a nearby seminary attempted to camp near the chapel. They lasted 3 nights. On the 4th, they reported hearing footsteps around their tent, just one set, always behind them, never approaching, never retreating. They packed to leave. One student found that the soles of his shoes were wet, but there had been no rain later. The group realized none of them had prayed once while they were there, and yet the bell rang 5 times that final night. No one saw the bell move. It hangs high in the steeple, corroded from decades of exposure, covered in soot from the time the field caught fire in '79. One side is visibly split, and still it rings. A facilities report from 1992 suggested the internal clapper had long since fallen out. The mechanism, rotted through. A diagram from that same report shows the cavities completely hollow, and yet, in every recorded instance of the tolling, the sound is whole, complete, as if something is striking it from the inside. A custodian named Elena, who worked on the grounds in the early 2000s, once said she saw light coming from inside the chapel, just a flicker. She hadn't meant to look in. She was sweeping the courtyard, glanced up, saw it through the side window. She said it looked like a candle, but the chapel had been sealed for years. She didn't tell anyone for a week, but when she did, she added something else. That before the light appeared, maybe 30 seconds before, she had this strange thought: someone's about to ask for something they don't deserve. And then the bell rang once. No wind that night, no movement in the trees, just that sound hanging in the air like smoke that never disperses. A bell whose rope had been cut decades ago. The chapel is listed on no tour maps. It isn't marked with a plaque. Visitors don't leave offerings. It's not mentioned in seminary lectures anymore, but when people speak of it, those who remember, they use the same phrase: it's still waiting. They don't say what is waiting or who, only that something was never finished, never removed, never fully closed, that whatever was behind the altar hasn't left and never will. Some believe it isn't a person, that it never was. It's the sound itself, or the space, or the gap between prayers and answers. And when the wind is quiet enough, when the night is still, that gap opens just wide, enough to ring. The bell hasn't sounded in months now. But last week, a man walking his dog along the far edge of the property claimed he heard a voice, not near, not distant, just beside him. It said nothing, only breathed. He turned, nothing there, but the dog refused to take another step. Later, the man returned home and scrubbed the soles of his shoes. There was no mud, no dirt, but they were wet and not from dew. He hasn't gone back, but he did write one thing in a note he left on the chapel fence: I didn't ask for anything. And at 3:12 that morning, there was one more toll, no echo, no reply. Just the silence that remains. The final minutes return to silence. The altar still stands. No door, no priest, just the bell. It tolls once for every unanswered prayer, and once more for the soul that still listens. And somewhere behind the carved lamb, something waits to be seen again. Asterisk.